The cabin was isolated, nestled deep in the woods, far from the resort. It was the perfect place to escape for a long weekend of skiing, away from the noise of everyday life. There were 4 of them: Jake, Lily, Mark, and Chloe. They had rented the cabin, excited for fresh powder and long runs on the slopes. It had been a long, stressful few months, and this trip was supposed to help them recharge. The first 2 days were exactly what they had hoped for. The weather was perfect, and the runs were wide open, untouched by too many skiers. They spent the days carving through the snow, and at night they relaxed by the fire, warming up over drinks and stories. There was something peaceful about being so far away from everything: no cell service, no distractions, just them and the mountain. But on the 3rd day, things began to feel different. It started after lunch. They'd had a few runs in the morning, and now they were on their way to the lift for one last ride before heading back to the cabin for the night. The sun was lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the slope. The air had turned a little colder, and the mountain had grown quieter as more people left for the day. "Last run, then we can head back," Mark said, his voice muffled by the wind. "I'm freezing." The group agreed, and they headed toward the top of the hill. The lift was practically empty now, just a few other skiers, but the trail at the top was wide open. Chloe, the most experienced skier, took the lead, carving down the slope with the others following close behind. It was a simple, long run, a beginner's slope for the most part, but the way the sun caught the snow made it feel like they were skiing through a winter wonderland. Halfway down, Lily fell behind. She wasn't the best skier, and the slope, though easy, was still challenging her. Jake, noticing she wasn't keeping up, slowed down to wait for her. The others kept going ahead. "I'll wait here with you," Jake said, skiing to the side to let Lily catch up. "Don't want you to get left behind." Lily gave a tired smile. "Thanks, I just need a minute." It was then that they both heard something. At first, it was just a faint sound scraping on the snow. Jake glanced up the slope, thinking it was another skier, maybe someone on a snowboard, but he couldn't see anyone. The wind was picking up now, and the snow had started to fall in small, soft flakes, but nothing too heavy. "Did you hear that?" Jake asked Lily. Lily looked up and shook her head. "What?" "That scraping sound, like someone's skiage is dragging." Lily furrowed her brow. "No, I didn't hear anything." They both stood still, listening for a moment, but the sound wasn't there anymore. It was probably nothing. Jake thought just the wind or the snow playing tricks on him. After a few minutes, Lily finally caught her breath and was ready to move again. They pushed off and began skiing down the last part of the run, heading toward the bottom of the slope. As they neared the lift, Jake looked up again, scanning the top of the mountain, still expecting to see the others coming down, but they were nowhere in sight. "Weird," he muttered under his breath, glancing back at the lift where a few skiers were still waiting. "They should be here by now." Lily, too, looked up the hill. "Maybe they went ahead," she said, but Jake wasn't sure. Something didn't feel right. At the base of the slope, they waited, looking up for their friends. Mark and Chloe had been ahead, but they never showed up. The lift operator asked them if they had seen the others, but they hadn't. "I'll ski back up and look for them," Jake decided, feeling a nagging sense of worrying in his gut. Lily insisted she'd stay by the lift to keep watch, so Jake took off, retracing the slope they had just skied. The wind had picked up, making it harder to see. Visibility was low, but Jake kept going, moving faster now, calling their names as he went. The mountain felt empty, quiet. There was no sound except for the howl of the wind. He reached the point where they had all skied together, but there was no sign of Mark or Chloe. He searched around for another few minutes, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong. That's when he noticed something odd. Fresh track ski marks cutting sharply into the snow, heading down the ridge where no one had been skiing earlier. Jake's heart rate picked up. The tracks were crisp, clear, like someone had just skied down them. But there were no signs of anyone coming up. It didn't make sense. He'd been there only minutes before and hadn't seen anyone. He followed the tracks cautiously, each turn feeling more wrong than the last. The sound of the wind made it hard to concentrate, and his thoughts kept spiraling. Where were Mark and Chloe? Why hadn't they waited for him? The tracks led to a small stand of trees near the edge of the slope, the kind of place you'd usually avoid skiing through, but the tracks led straight into it. Jake's breath caught in his throat when he saw the edge of a ski pole sticking out from behind a tree. It was Mark's pole. The rest of the skis and poles were scattered in the snow, but there was no sign of Mark or Chloe. Jake's heart pounded as he moved toward the trees. The last bit of daylight was fading fast, and the wind howled louder now, like a scream in the distance. He tried calling out their names again, but his voice felt swallowed by the silence. And then he saw it. There, half buried in the snow, was Chloe's ski boot, still strapped to her binding. Jake crouched down to inspect it, but his gut twisted, and he stood up quickly, as if something cold had gripped his spine. The tracks were getting fresher, deeper now. Someone had been skiing recently. The footprints seemed to be leading further away, heading toward the trees. Just before he turned to follow them, he heard it. The scrape again, the sound of skis on snow. But this time, it was close. He whipped around. A shadow moved at the far edge of the trees, just out of sight. The scraping grew louder, closer. He shouted, "Mark, Chloe." But his voice barely made it past the wind. The shadow stepped into view, a figure, dressed in ski gear, but there was something wrong. The figure didn't look like a skier. It was moving in an unnatural way, as if it didn't belong on the mountain at all. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished back into the trees, leaving Jake alone in the snow, with only the eerie sound of scraping to follow. By the time he got back to the lift, Lily was gone, too. No sign of her anywhere, and the ski resort had emptied out. When the search team arrived the next morning, the only thing they found were the strange, erratic tracks leading into the forest, where no skier should have been. There were no bodies, no blood, no sign of where Chloe, Mark, or Lily had gone. But they found something else: several ski poles, all belonging to different skiers, left behind in a pile near the trees. They were all fresh, and they had been buried in the snow. The search party didn't find Jake. They searched for days, combing through the slopes and the nearby forests, but there was no sign of him, no trace of where he had gone. The only thing they found was his ski jacket, abandoned at the lift's base, half buried in the snow. When they finally left, the mountain remained as quiet and desolate as ever. The lift, though, still ran, and the wind, at night, still whispered through the trees. Some say you can still hear the sound of scraping skis, late into the evening, just before the sun sets. The ski trip had been Emma's idea. She'd booked the cabin months in advance, raving about the untouched powder, the quiet slopes, and the quaint charm of a small, remote resort. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend with friends, just her, Sam, Ben, and Tara, a chance to get away from the hustle of everyday life. They hadn't really cared about the weather when they first planned it. They just wanted to spend some time together in the mountains. But now, as they unloaded their gear from the car at the lodge and looked up at the steep, snow-dusted peaks, Emma felt a gnawing unease that she couldn't shake. The fog had rolled in thick overnight, swallowing the mountains and giving everything a shadowy, dreamlike quality. There was something unsettling about the stillness, the heavy quiet that seemed to hang in the air. "Isn't this amazing?" Tara said, smiling, her breath a puff of steam in the cold air. "It feels like we're the only ones up here." Emma didn't answer immediately. She wanted to agree, but the isolation of the place felt less magical and more oppressive. Even the lodge itself, while cozy, had an air of neglect, as though it had been sitting untouched for years. The floorboards creaked underfoot, the walls were a little too thin, and the staff had been unusually distant when they checked in. Sam, always the skeptic, shrugged. "We've got the place to ourselves. Perfect." The others didn't seem to share Emma's unease, so she pushed it down, determined to enjoy the trip. They suited up in their gear and headed to the slopes. The ski lifts were old, rickety things, the kind that made strange, clinking noises as they ascended, almost as if they were creaking under the weight of time itself. The fog hadn't lifted, and the mountain was eerily quiet, save for the wind's occasional howl. The trail they'd chosen was empty, completely empty. Emma didn't mind at first. After all, it was a Tuesday afternoon, and the resort wasn't exactly a hotspot. But still, she glanced around at her friends. Ben and Tara were already laughing as they raced down the slope, while Sam was too focused on his phone to notice her lingering discomfort. "Come on, Em, catch up," Tara called from the bottom, already waiting with her arms spread wide like she was expecting a hug. "Yeah, stop being so paranoid," Sam added, his tone light. Emma smiled weakly and pushed herself down the slope, her skis carving clean arcs through the snow. As she descended, the fog seemed to thicken, swirling around her like a thick curtain. The mountain felt like it was closing in. The lift, which had been so high above them, now felt like an afterthought. The sound of the wind had become muffled, and the only noise was the swoosh of her skis cutting through the snow. At the bottom, Tara and Ben were waiting, but Emma noticed that Sam was no longer behind her. He had been right behind her only moments ago. "Where's Sam?" Emma asked, scanning the misty slope above them. "I thought he was right behind you," Ben said. He looked back up the hill, his brow furrowing. Maybe he stopped for a break. Emma didn't like the feeling that settled in her chest. Sam was an experienced skier. He didn't stop unless there was a reason, and he would have let them know if something had gone wrong. "I'll go check on him," Emma said, pushing off again. The others shrugged and began to make their way to the lodge, but Emma kept her eyes fixed on the lift. She took the same path back up the slope, the fog thickening with every turn. The sound of her skis grew dull, as though the mountain itself was swallowing her movements. She reached the lift and found nothing. No sign of Sam, not even a trail in the snow where he might have fallen. It was as if he had simply disappeared. Panic began to rise in her chest. Where could he have gone? The fog was thick enough to disorient even the most experienced skier, but they weren't far from the lift. He couldn't have just vanished. "Sam!" she shouted, her voice barely cutting through the dense mist. There was no answer. She pulled her phone out of her pocket and dialed his number, but it went straight to voicemail. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she started down the slope again, zigzagging across the path, her skis kicking up powder as she searched frantically. Minutes passed, then an hour, and there was still no sign of him. The others hadn't returned either. "Sam!" she screamed, her voice hoarse now. She skidded to a stop, hearing a faint sound beneath the wind, a rustling, like something dragging through the snow. She turned sharply, her heart leaping into her throat. The sound was closer now. Then she saw him. Sam was standing at the edge of the slope, his back to her. His skis were stuck in the snow, and his body was hunched over, like he was studying something in the snow. The way he stood was wrong and natural, stiff, like he was being pulled by invisible strings. "Sam!" she called again, this time with more force, but he didn't move. He just stood there, as if he hadn't heard her. Emma took a cautious step forward, the hair on the back of her neck standing up. Something wasn't right. She called his name once more, but this time, she noticed something even stranger. Sam's face, partially obscured by his goggles, was pale. His eyes were wide, but there was no recognition in them. He seemed empty, as though the person standing before her wasn't Sam at all. Without warning, he turned around, slowly, almost mechanically. When their eyes met, her stomach twisted. His eyes weren't Sam's anymore. They were cold, hollow, black as the depths of the ocean. Emma froze. The wind howled, and the figure began to move towards her, dragging his skis with an unsettling scrape. His movements were jerky, stiff like a puppet on strings. And then, from behind him, a sound reached her ears. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, a low, scraping sound, followed by a crackling hiss, like something wet being dragged across snow. Something else was with him. Emma's legs went weak, but she forced herself to back away, her heart hammering. She knew she needed to leave, to get back to the lodge, but her legs wouldn't move. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw them. A series of figures, some crawling, others stumbling, emerged from the fog, all dressed in ski gear, their eyes wide and vacant. They dragged their skis through the snow with the same erratic, frantic movements. They were all around her now, closing in, their mouths opening and closing in silence. Suddenly, Emma snapped into motion. She pushed herself forward, her legs burning, and fled back down the slope. The figures behind her were getting closer, far too close, but Emma couldn't stop. She didn't dare look back. All she could hear was the scraping of skis on snow, the hiss of their movements. Finally, she reached the lift and stumbled into the station, her breath ragged. She glanced over her shoulder one last time. There was no one there. The fog had swallowed everything. Sam, the figures, they were gone. She turned to the lift operator, but he didn't seem to notice her. He was staring out into the mist, his eyes glazed. What is happening?" she gasped. The operator didn't answer. He just stared ahead, as if he hadn't heard her at all. Then, from behind her, Emma heard it, the scrape of skis, coming from the dark fog, and she knew they were still out there. The ski resort was nearly empty when Clara and her friends arrived. It was the off-season, a perfect time to get away and escape the crowds. The small, family-owned lodge nestled on the edge of a mountain range felt charming and isolated, its wooden beams creaking under the weight of the snow and age. They didn't mind the quiet. After all, the fewer people around, the better. That first day was everything Clara had hoped for: fresh powder, clear skies, and no lines at the lifts. They spent hours skiing and laughing, soaking in the mountain air. But as evening fell, the weather shifted. The winds picked up, and snow began to fall heavily, as if the mountain was swallowing them whole. By the time they'd gotten to the last lift, the mountain was already blanketed in a thick veil of white. "One last run," Ben called out to the group, his breath forming clouds in the cold. Before they closed the lift, Clara hesitated. "I don't know, the weather's getting bad." "It's fine," Tara shouted back, already pulling on her skis. "We'll be quick. It's just a short loop." Clara sighed but agreed. They all piled into the lift, which was the last one running for the night. The lift operator, an older man with a weathered face, gave them a tired smile. "Be careful up there," he said. "The storm's getting worse." "It's gonna be tough coming down in this." Ben shrugged it off. "We're fine. We're just doing a quick run." The lift creaked as it ascended, and the snow started coming down faster, turning the mountain into a blur of white. Clara had to squint to see ahead, her skis barely cutting through the thick layer of snow accumulating with every second. The trail, which had been well-groomed earlier in the day, was now a maze of deep, untouched drifts. "Well, this is ominous," Clara said, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "We're fine," Ben said again, though even he sounded less sure. "Just stick together. Let's go straight down. We'll make it to the lodge in no time." They started down the slope, but the wind was so fierce that it felt like they were skiing in a snowstorm, rather than just through it. Clara had to squint to see ahead, her skis barely cutting through the thick layer of snow accumulating with every second. The trail, which had been well-groomed earlier in the day, was now a maze of deep, untouched drifts. Clara felt a strange unease settle in her stomach. She hadn't heard any other skiers since the lift ride up, and it was getting harder to navigate through the heavy snow. Tara had fallen behind. Ben and Clara were in the front, trying to carve a path, but it was exhausting. "Guys, I think we should turn back," Clara said, starting to feel the first stirrings of panic. "This is getting dangerous." Ben didn't respond. He was skiing ahead, as if he hadn't heard her, or perhaps he was too focused on the descent. She glanced back. Tara was nowhere in sight. "Tara," Clara called, but her voice was swallowed by the mist. Clara turned to Ben. "We need to stop. This isn't right." Ben frowned, scanning the trees and the slope. "She must have fallen behind. Let's wait up for her." But Tara didn't appear. Clara's stomach twisted as the seconds stretched on. She could barely see more than a few feet in front of her. She called again, more urgently, her breath catching in her throat. "Tara, where are you?" There was no response, no trace of her friend in the foggy whiteness. "Ben, this isn't funny," Clara said, her voice trembling. "Where is she?" Ben frowned, scanning the trees and the slope. "I don't know. We can't stay out here much longer. Let's keep going down to the lodge." "Maybe she'd catch up." Clara nodded reluctantly. They started skiing again, though Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As they made their way down the mountain, Clara kept glancing back, waiting for Tara to catch up. They were nearly halfway down when Clara heard something, a faint, almost imperceptible noise coming from the side of the trail. She stopped and listened, her heart hammering. It was a soft scraping sound, like skis dragging in the snow. "Ben," she whispered urgently, "do you hear that?" Ben stopped in his tracks, his face pale. "What? What is that?" The sound was getting closer, scraping, dragging, shuffling. "Maybe it's Tara," Clara said, her voice barely steady. "Maybe she's hurt." But when the figure finally emerged from the dense snow, it wasn't Tara. It was a man. His skis were tangled, dragging behind him like he couldn't stand up straight. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide, unblinking. He moved unnaturally, jerking forward in a way that was disturbingly wrong. Ben froze. "Who the hell is that?" The man stopped a few feet away, standing perfectly still in the snow. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, he raised his arm and pointed straight at them. His finger was long and frozen, almost skeletal. Clara's heart raced. We need to get out of here, now. They turned and skied faster, the man's slow shuffle echoing behind them. For a moment, Clara felt like she could hear something else's voices, faint whispers coming from all directions. The snow seemed to close in tighter with each passing second, and she realized she couldn't see the lift anymore. The slope was a blur of white, and the storm felt as though it were closing in on them. Ben was ahead now, the fear on his face more palpable than ever. "We're almost there," he called, his voice cracking. "The lodge is just up ahead. We just need to keep going." But when they reached the bottom of the hill, there was no lodge. There was only darkness. The snowstorm had blotted out everything around them. Clara's breathing became shallow, panic rising in her chest. "Ben, where's the lodge?" Ben was still skiing ahead, but his movements were slow, labored, like he didn't know where he was going anymore. He skied right past the snow-covered chairlift station, and Clara's stomach dropped as she looked down the empty slope. She could hear something coming up behind them now, shuffling, scraping, and the whispers, like faint voices carried by the wind, grew louder. Suddenly, a hand shot out of the fog, grabbing her wrist with a force that made her cry out. Clara froze, the hand was cold, and the grip was like iron, dragging her back through the snow. She looked up, it was Ben. But it wasn't Ben. His face was pale, his eyes wide and hollow, just like the others. His mouth was slightly open, and there was a strange, awful stillness about him. His lips didn't move, but his hand, still gripping her wrist, was pulling her toward the others, toward the group of twisted, motionless skiers who were now surrounding her. "Ben, no," Clara gasped, struggling against his grip, but her strength was failing. What happened to you?" He didn't respond. The figures around them began to move closer, slowly circling, closing in. Clara felt a coldness wash over her, as if the snow itself was seeping into her very bones. The scraping sound was deafening now, the twisted skiers dragging themselves toward her, their dead eyes fixed on her with no sign of recognition. Clara's mind screamed for escape, but her body was frozen in terror. She couldn't fight, couldn't move. She was trapped in a nightmare. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was the lift. The old, empty chairlift still running, ascending into the thick fog. And then, there was nothing. Alright everyone, that brings us to the end of our story. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more content like this, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. And if you have similar stories you'd like to share with us, feel free to reach out. Thank you for watching, and until next time, take care.